Tonight, Dr. Jensen will be closing the Pedagogy of Privilege conference with his keynote talk, Beyond Multiculturalism, Taking Power and Privilege Seriously in Teaching Diversity, in which he explores if the transformative potential of teaching about diversity has been tamed by depoliticized multiculturalism. Please welcome Dr. Jensen.
Can I close this? Is that okay? Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so very, very much for giving me a reason to leave Texas, even if only for a couple of days. Although, in some ways, living in Austin, Texas is very much like living in the sort of pockets of Denver or Boulder, I'm told. Sort of bubbles of progressive thought in an otherwise conservative state, so maybe I just came home in a different landscape. It's really wonderful to be here. This is sort of the close of my academic year as well, and a good chance to take stock, which is always important. And it's been really enjoyable to do it with so many creative people, especially people from outside the disciplines I usually work in. So I am actually really grateful for this. It's been very, very helpful for me. Since we're talking about privilege, let me start with an acknowledgement by my own, which really I don't have to do because you can figure it out. I am white in a world dominated by white folks. I'm male in a world dominated by men. I am a citizen of the United States in a world dominated by the U.S. And I, as a faculty member, live comfortably in the middle class in a very unequal economic system. So my privilege is relatively straightforward. I always think of a friend of mine who says, Jensen, if you had been born good looking, you would have had it all. The best part of that is it's my minister who tells me that all the time, so trying to keep me humble, I think. But I thought I would start in terms of reflections on my own privilege by one particular part of that, which is being not only a faculty member, but a tenured faculty member at a major research university. I'm one of the few people in the world who has a job where I can say anything I want, and they can't fire me. That's really nice. To be able to say anything you want, to speak the truth as you believe it, and to suffer virtually no recrimination for that. It is a very rare position in this society. I think, therefore, to start off, I want to reflect on what one does with that particular kind of privilege, which is so rare. Given the kinds of things I've been working on and writing about, it seems to me that one thing I should be doing with that particular kind of privilege is pushing into areas that may not be safe for others to push who don't share that particular privilege. That one thing we who have tenure in institutions like this can do is say the things that others might be punished for saying. Sometimes that means that my job is to be the craziest person in the room. Literally, the one who will say the most radical things, knowing that if someone who wasn't male or wasn't white or wasn't a U.S. citizen, if a person from one of those other categories were to say it, there might be consequences. So that's literally, I think, what I do a lot of these days, is go around and be the craziest person in the room. No offense, but here I don't want to compete with a fairly large group. So what I want to do tonight is something slightly different, kind of a variation on that. And that is to be perhaps the harshest person in the room. Someone with the particular privilege I have and then the added privilege of closing the conference. I want to be harsh tonight. Now, I think harshness is not inconsistent with, in some ways, the tenderness that Becky spoke about last night. That harshness is not inconsistent with love. And I was thinking of ways others more eloquent than I have expressed that. And you may remember Che Guevara, the great revolutionary in Cuba, who's famously known for one particular phrase where he said it may seem sentimental, but the true revolutionary, he said, is always guided by great feelings of love, which some people took as an odd expression from someone committed to a revolution that was, of course, violent. If you read the rest of the letter from which that comes, Guevara goes on to explain that love then requires you to often act in very harsh ways, ways that will seem harsh to the people around you who love you and harsh in your actions in the world. So I don't think love and harshness are inconsistent. Another place I've always enjoyed the expression of this comes from Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov, which I've never read, but I quote it because I think it kind of makes me sound smart. I used to quote it without admitting I'd never read it, and then I realized that's bullshit. You can't do that. So I never read the book. There are a lot of dense Russian novels I haven't. This is only one of the dense Russian novels I've never read. There's a long list of them. But there's a line in that actually I stumbled upon it because Dorothy Day from the Catholic Worker Movement used to quote this often. And the line is, "Love in action is a harsh and dreadful thing compared with love in dreams." And I think that's an important recognition, that to speak in the abstract about love is always easy, but love in action is a harsh and dreadful thing compared to that love in the abstract, that love in dreams. And so what I'd like to talk a bit tonight about is what that love looks like, understood harshly in the world in which we live. So let's spend a minute then talking about the world in which we live, the context in which we have these discussions. As I get older and I think about my own political activity and the things I think are most important, they come under really two headings at this point: justice and sustainability. I think one way to understand the problems we face in the world is to recognize we live in a profoundly unjust world and a fundamentally unsustainable world. So, to the question of justice, there's one statistic I think that captures this quite well. The last World Bank report I looked at indicated that half the world's population, more than 3 billion people on the planet today, live on less than $2.50 US a day. Half the world's population lives on less than I will probably spend on a cup of coffee at the Denver airport tomorrow when I leave town. That means half the world's population lives without the resources for anything that we could call a minimally decent life. As we sit here tonight, 3 billion people on this planet live in that abject misery. That is a profoundly unjust world. I think it's also a fundamentally unsustainable world. Here, I'm not going to point to a statistic, but just ask that you look at any statistic that reflects the health of the ecosystem that makes our own lives possible. The news is all bad. And this is not just the news on global warming or rapid climate change, or as some have started to call it, climate breakdown. Look at any indicator of the health of this ecosystem, and you will see a world in dramatic decline. That might be groundwater contamination, topsoil loss, the number and growing size of the dead zones in the Gulf. Take a look at any number you want. And what becomes clear is the systems in which we live are not only profoundly unjust, but are fundamentally unsustainable. So, if we are going to truly love, I think we have to first start with the recognition of the world in which we try to love, and recognize that if we are going to be truly alive, it is to confront this, and it is a harsh reality. So, how do we cope with that harshness? Well, I think the only way to cope with it is through struggle and resistance to the systems that create that world. That world does not come about by accident. It is the predictable consequence of the systems in which we live. So it's important to not only address the specific injuries of individuals and communities as a result of this, but to also take up a position of resistance to the systems and structures of power, the institutions that come out of those systems and structures that make the injustice and the unsustainability inevitable. And that means to be in constant resistance to the notion of hierarchy, which structures all of these systems. And that's where I want to move to the stated topic tonight, getting beyond multiculturalism. I think that concept, of course, is not original to me. People have been critiquing the way in which resistance to systems and structures of power has been co-opted under this concept of multiculturalism. So what I want to do tonight is, first of all, just summarize the ways we could approach the questions that have been the subject of the conference today, ways that the culture might address them. Then go forward to talk about the nature of those systems, to illustrate the problems, and also to start to think about what we might do to overcome them. So let me start by thinking through the way the culture responds. When one identifies injuries that result from race, gender, class, the kind of holy trinity of multiculturalism, yes, race, gender, and class. We all know this. We all have every department we come out of. We have courses, yes, race in my world, race, gender, and class in media, race, gender, society, race, gender, and class in theology. There's race, gender, and class in everything, right? It's become institutionalized, which is your first indication there's something dangerously wrong when administrators so easily succumb to it. All right. So when we talk about these things as a culture, it seems to me that there are really three ways people discuss them. The first is to approach problems that come under this heading, race, gender, class, as fundamentally personal and, in some sense, psychological. So when there is a racist act, for instance, one approach the culture might take is to try and understand why that happened. What is wrong with the people who committed that racist act? Built into that, of course, which is the culture is generally healthy, that the culture is generally, and that there are a reason, be it psychological problems or, inadequate education, but there's something wrong with these particular people. I was thinking of an example of this. There was a group of law students at the University of Texas, the elite law school of the state of Texas, who had thrown one of these so-called parties, where predominantly white folks dress up like what they believe to be African Americans and Latinos who live in the ghetto, and then they come and party. And of course, this being the digital world, these parties are photographed. And this being the world in which we know no modesty, on the web and these things. And some UT law students threw one of these parties about 2 years ago. And the dean of the UT Law School, he sprang into action. And he told these boys and girls that they had behaved badly and that in the United States we didn't do these things, right? And that they should learn from their mistakes. So it was treated as, it was treated on the assumption that the University of Texas Law School is a place of great racial equality and harmony. In Texas, that would have been an even bigger laugh line because people know the history of the UT Law School, right? And that you had these deviant children who were simply immature, psychologically unbalanced, who knew what the problem was, right? That's an approach that I take it in this group we can push aside without discussion, that no one here likely sees the outbursts of racism in something like a ghetto party as merely the product of a deviant individual. Okay. The second place people tend to move is to this level of the cultural. And I want to make it clear, I have nothing against the idea of multiculturalism or cultural competence or diversity. I was born and raised in North Dakota. I know what it's like to grow up in a monoculture, and it's not healthy. And I'm grateful for all of the multicultural education and experience I've been able to accumulate since I left North Dakota. So I'm not suggesting that it's not important for people to know more, to experience more widely. But I think we run into trouble if we think that the problems that arise from race, gender, and class are simply a product of a lack of knowledge or experience, and that therefore multiculturalism or diversity education can somehow cure the problem. So I think what we have to do is move, obviously, away from the personal or the psychological explanations, but also past the cultural, and recognize that these are questions of the political. And here I don't mean politics in the traditional sense of electoral politics. I mean the distribution of power. In any society, there is a distribution of power. That is the terrain of the political. And that is where we need to address these questions. If there is going to be progress in a meaningful sense, if there is going to be a cure to the problems, to the injuries that arise under this heading of race, gender, and class, it is going to be a political solution. And it will come through struggle, as all political solutions do. So I don't want to suggest that those of us who dedicate our lives to education in some sense have no role. I'm saying it's not enough to simply dedicate one's life to education. There is another level of struggle that has to go on. And I think from there, I want to go forward back to this holy trinity of race, gender, and class, and investigate that a bit to help us shape the political agenda we might want to take up. So, since most of us here are in education, let's ask a simple question. When we're interested in these questions around race, gender, and class, what do we study? How do we properly understand what we are studying? And I would suggest that what we are not studying, or what we should not be studying, is race, gender, and class. Race, gender, and class are identity categories. I have a race, I have a gender, I have a class, so does everyone else. But those are really not where we should be focusing our attention, because it's too easy to drift off into the abstract, I think. So if we're not going to focus on identity categories, if what we study or what we should study is not race, gender, and class, the next step might be to say, well, then we should study the injuries that arise as a result of those identity categories. And so we might name those racism, sexism, and the accompanying heterosexism, and what is sometimes called classism. I don't know about you, but it's not a word that's ever fallen off my tongue very naturally. Classism is a strange invented term, I think. So we could talk about, well, the focus of our study, what we're really here to study is racism, sexism, and heterosexism, and classism. But that's really the end of the road either. It's perfectly fine, just as it's fine to understand there are these categories of race, gender, and class. It's also that for those categories there are injuries under these headings: racism, sexism, heterosexism, and classism. But if we really want to be effective in promoting social change, it seems to me we need to go to the nature of the systems from which those identities and injuries arise. And that is what we should be studying, which means instead of race, gender, and class in media, we should have a course called White Supremacy, Patriarchy, and a Predatory Economic System, commonly known as Corporate Capitalism, in media. Now, the fact that no one in the room, everyone laughed in recognition that that would be impossible to get into the course catalog, at least at the University of Texas, I don't know about the University of Denver, tells you that we might have actually now gotten to something that's meaningful. That those people who are in fact in charge of maintaining a white supremacist, patriarchal, capitalist system, when they start to push back, it tells you you've gotten somewhere. So let's spend a bit of time talking about that. I would argue, and by your reaction I would guess many of you would agree, that it is appropriate to describe the contemporary United States as a white supremacist, patriarchal, and predatory corporate capitalist system. Now, that might be an easy sell here, but take that one out into the world, folks, and what do you get? You get a whole lot of pushback. That those terms, in fact, while they may have once been appropriate to describe the United States, are no longer appropriate given the gains of the civil rights movement, given the gains of feminist movements, and given the success, in quotes, of the capitalist system. Well, let's then think for a minute about how we would justify the use of those terms in our classrooms, in our communities, around the family dinner table. That one's always good for me to imagine, given my particular family of origin, how to make this case around the family dinner table. Well, what does it mean to claim the United States is a white supremacist society, given the important gains of the civil rights movement? That we did pass a Civil Rights Act, a Voting Rights Act, fair housing legislation. We did elect an African-American president. How in the world can one call that a white supremacist society when the formal trappings of apartheid have been abandoned? Well, here I think in making the case, in trying to organize how to speak to people about this, we can talk about two important facets of life: the material realities and the ideological realities. If you want to understand a system and how to describe it, you can talk about the world that is, the material realities. What's life on the ground like? And you can think about how people think about that life. What are the ideological realities? We have plentiful data and scholarship to help us. So if we're going to make the case that the United States is a white supremacist society, how would we make that case in regard to the material realities? Well, here the case is easily made. If you look at what I tend to call the measures of wealth and well-being, all of the data that we have in this society that indicate how well people are doing in the world. I mean things like annual income, wealth, home ownership, high school graduation rates, infant mortality, access to health care. Pick a stat. What you find is when you look across the board at those measures of wealth and well-being, there is a racialized gap across the board between white and non-white America. That is, white people on average are doing better than non-white people on average on all of these measures. It doesn't mean, of course, every single white person is doing better than every single non-white person. We're talking about patterns, which is our appropriate focus in sociology. If you look, just because the black-white divide is so central to U.S. history, look for a second at the data on the racialized gap in wealth and well-being between white and black America, and what you find is not only does that gap persist, but that if you compare the data from the immediate aftermath of the civil rights movement, late 60s, early 70s, compare that data to today, and you will find on some of those measures the racialized disparity between white and black America has actually grown in the 5 decades since the civil rights movement. Has narrowed. It is that parity, rough equality, is decades, in some cases, centuries away at a country that is the most affluent country in the history of the world. We have resources at our disposal unparalleled in human history. This is also a country, remember, that likes to think of itself as capable of doing anything, yes? We're Americans, right? What Americans do when they want to do something, they do it, right? You roll up, well, I already rolled up my sleeves, but if I hadn't, I would have rolled up my sleeves, and I would have got the job done. You know what I'm talking about, brother? Absolutely, goddamn right. Okay, so we're Americans. We want to send a man. What the hell do we do? Goddamn right, send a man to move. It wasn't the Ruskies that sent a man to move, it was the Americans. You know what I'm talking about? Okay, goddamn right. All right. 17 years in Texas has eroded some of my Midwest nature. Okay, so in the most affluent country in the history of the world, with a belief that it can accomplish anything, if it has not been able to close the racialized gaps in wealth and well-being, what does that tell you? Tells me the dominant culture does not want to. All right, so the material realities, I think, easily justify the claim that the United States, again, with all the advances since the civil rights movement, and we don't want to minimize or trivialize that, because people, ordinary people, suffered, sacrificed, and often died to achieve those gains. But even with those gains, the material reality is, I think, appropriately described as white supremacist. Well, what about the way people think? What about the ideological realities? Well, there's some interesting studies that help us. Now, of course, in polite society, nobody stands up and asserts overtly racist claims anymore. Well, it was ever since the Supreme Court nomination. It's been a little hard, but no. But what I mean is, if you want to be admitted into polite society, if you want to run for office, you do not stand up and say, "I am a white man who believes that black people are inherently inferior." Okay. Now, that's the way we talk. It's not necessarily the way we think. So in polite society, now, and let me just pause. By that, I don't mean that there aren't circles in which white people who are out of public view don't say such things. Those of us who are white see them on occasion. So I'm not suggesting that we've erased that overt white supremacist thinking. I'm saying that in the dominant culture, in polite society, the price of admission is to leave that kind of articulation behind. And I also think, at least at this point, a majority, I'm not sure what kind of majority I would claim, of white America does believe they hold those ideas. Right? But the what we say about is not necessarily what we think, and there's some interesting work in sociology on this. Let me just summarize quickly a series of studies that I think get at the unconscious ideas, the ideas that we may not articulate but we still hold. Some of you may know these studies that use paired resumes. So the researcher will construct fictionalized resumes, equivalent in all regards: work experience, educational levels, age, schools attended, everything. The only difference in the resumes are that one will have a traditionally white-sounding name, like Bob Jensen, and the other one will have a traditionally black-sounding name, like Jamal Washington or something, or the female equivalents. And the researchers will send these resumes to employers who are actually advertising for hiring. And what they have found consistently, and this has been replicated in more than one study, is that the callback rate for the white-sounding name is always significantly higher. That is, when they chart the number of employers who call back for a potential interview, the callback rate for white names significantly higher, sometimes as much as twice as high as the callback rate for black names. Again, remember, equivalent resumes. The last study that I saw on this changed up one other element that was very interesting. On the white-sounding name, they gave that applicant an acknowledged criminal conviction for drug possession with a year of jail time, prison time. So an acknowledged convicted felony arrest, an acknowledged felony conviction, excuse me. On the black-sounding name, no criminal history. All right. They found that the callback rate for the white-sounding name with the acknowledged felony conviction was still higher than the callback rate for the black-sounding name, which, if you think about it, means that in the current job market, being black is a greater liability than being a convicted felon. Right? That's the way people think. Now, I would go out on a limb and say that the majority of those personnel directors didn't pick up the resumes and say, black-sounding name, pitch that one. I'm a racist. Let's get rid of the black candidates. My guess is most of it was unconscious, the associations that come with those names. And I see a lot of us nodding because a lot of us struggle with that, even as we try to commit to social justice work. So I think it's fair also, if you take that, as well as the acknowledged racist attitudes that still exist and come out, increasingly often, it seems, in recent years, I think it's still fair to say that the United States, in ideological terms, is a white supremacist society. So when we take these ideas into the classroom and the community, I think we should use the terms that most accurately describe the world in which we live and describe the system. And I think white supremacist is that. The fact that it will not be warmly received in all quarters is only more reason, it seems to me, to push and to use that as an opportunity to make these claims. Well, let's look at the other system, second system, patriarchy. Here again, we can look at material realities and ideological realities. The material realities, in some ways, are parallel. Even with the gains of the feminist movement, there are still systematic patterns of discrimination against women in business, education, and other arenas. But I think the statistics that are most important in remembering the material realities of women are the statistics around sexual violence. There have been a fair number of studies now that make it fairly clear that about 1 out of 5 women in the United States today will be the victim of a rape or an attempted rape as legally defined in their lifetime. That's 1 out of 5. 19% is what most of the studies show now. That's only part of the story, because if you move outside of the category of sexual violence as it's defined by law and investigate a category that I have taken to calling sexual intrusion, that is unwanted sexual intrusions by men into the lives of women. And that can be anything from harassment on the street, more systematic harassment in the workplace or in the classroom, and not only that kind of violence that meets the legal definition of rape, but a whole range of sexualized aggressions that women endure. I've done a very careful scientific study of this, and I have determined that the percentage of women in the contemporary United States who have experienced sexual intrusion is 100%. Okay. I didn't do a scientific study, but it doesn't take a scientific study to recognize that. All right. That's a material reality. That tells us we live in a patriarchal culture. Well, what about the way people think? What about the ideological reality? Well, here we don't really have to go to the unconscious, because it's still a society in which claims about masculinity and femininity, essentialized notions of what it means to be a male and what it means to be a female are still very much common currency. They may be debated in some circles, but to stand up and say, well, I just think men are this way and women are this way, and that's just the way it is, whether that's rooted in some theological or sociobiological claim, is not defined out of polite society. People say it all the time. So on that count, I think it's just self-evident. We have a culture that still thinks in patriarchal terms. So just as white supremacist is still an accurate description of the United States, I think patriarchal is still an accurate description of the United States. Well, what about that last category? That's the one that gets really dicey when you start talking about the economic system, because remember, we now live in the post-Soviet world in which the natural superiority of capitalism was proved, yes, by the titanic struggle between the U.S. and the Soviet Union in the Cold War, ending in the vanquishing of the evil, godless communists by the gracious capitalist system. And therefore, capitalism is talked about not just as an economic system that one might choose, but really as the only economic system that can structure the world. It is, in some sense, put forward as the state of nature. Well, I would always modify capitalist with the term predatory, because to mark capitalism appropriately, one must understand it as a predatory system. And here again, we want to look at the material realities. The distribution of wealth is quite easy to understand. I gave you one statistic on that at the world level. Half the world's population living on less than 50 cents a day is, for the most part, a product of global capitalism. The extension of the capitalist system now to virtually the entire planet. You can look internally to the United States, other capitalist societies as well, and see the same kind of inequality, and you can see it growing in recent years. So in the United States, there are different ways to carve up the statistics, but in general, for some time now, about 10% of the population of the United States has controlled about 80% of the wealth of the country. A material condition of incredible inequality, and therefore, if we are to take seriously our own stated moral principles about equality, it seems to me one to be identified as predatory and a problem. The ideological realities also are quite clear. Instead of recognizing this as the inevitable product of the system, a hierarchical system that distributes wealth unequally and unfairly, we're told this is in fact the product of a meritocracy, that this is the way the world works, this is the way the world should work, that in fact it works this way because the people who get rich are the people who work hard and are smart, and the people who don't get rich are the people who don't work hard and are less intelligent, yes? Because it conforms to your experience that everyone you've ever known who was rich was hardworking and intelligent, yes? And everyone you've known who was not well off was lazy and less intelligent. Right? I mean, it falls apart in 5 seconds because we all know it would be impolite to point to the people who are often wealthy without any apparent effort or intelligence. I must say, I don't spend a lot of time beating up on George Bush, but in the 8 years he was president, this case was really easy to make. You just sort of put his picture up, right? And of course, we all know people who have struggled their whole lives, worked incredibly hard their whole lives, people of great character and intelligence who never accumulated wealth in the system, because that's the way the system's designed. So I think if we're going to do the work we need to do, we need to talk about not these abstract categories of race, gender, and class, not even about racism and sexism, heterosexism and classism. Those are fine terms to describe categories and injuries, but we need to talk about the nature of the systems from which these injuries arise. And if we're going to do that honestly, we're going to have to use terms that will not be easily accepted by the dominant culture. But if we don't, we're going to miss the point. And the point is change in those systems. Because those systems are all at their core based on hierarchy. And here, while each one of those systems has its own unique history, its own contemporary manifestation, we can also see the common element in them all. All of those systems create hierarchy. And then all of those systems do their best to naturalize that hierarchy. And I think that's worth pausing at that point to remember why it has to be that way. All of those systems are hierarchical. They're based on the assertion that people have the right to rule over a class of people. It's hierarchy, and the injuries arise from that hierarchy. Right? Now, the reason that has to be naturalized is because we all have value systems that are fundamentally opposed to hierarchy. I don't care where your values come from. I don't care if they're rooted in a theological system or a secular system. Right? At this point in human history, any system that we would claim shapes our values is going to be based on a couple of fundamental premises. One is the inherent dignity of all people, that you and I and every one of us are morally indistinguishable from another. We are all the same, and we all have a claim to dignity. That is what it means to be human in all of these systems. All of these systems also make a call to equality. Perhaps not perfect equality, but some rough equality. Just take the three major religious systems we talk about, the monotheistic ones, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. All have some version of that call to equality, that recognition of the inherent dignity of all. In fact, all of the systems we might claim, secular systems too. Right? So if we live in systems and structures of power, which give rise to institutions which are fundamentally hierarchical, they are in grotesque violation of our own values. Here I'm not imposing my values, I'm simply reflecting on the quite obvious fact that they are in opposition to all our values. So how can one hold values and celebrate those hierarchies? It's a bit of a problem, you've noticed, yes? Well, the way that we do it is to claim that these hierarchies are in fact natural. Right? That white supremacy arose because of the inherent superiority of white over non-white, and the proof of that is that whites have been successful at conquering the planet. And even though you can't say that in polite company anymore, I think when you scratch below the surface of this society, the white population of this society, and I don't just mean the most reactionary right-wing elements in the society, but even a lot of the polite liberal elements, that there is still an underlying belief in white supremacy as a natural state of being, as the natural order. So that hierarchy has to be naturalized because that hierarchy is in opposition to our own values. The same with patriarchy, the hierarchy of men over women, right? Inconsistent with our basic values, therefore it has to be naturalized, either theologically, right, that's the way God intended it, you know, the order, the pecking order, according to this theology, There's husband, wife, child, dog, cat, goldfish, whatever the hierarchy is, right? There it is. And it's proclaimed by God. Right? It's right up front. This is another one of those things. Whereas in race, it has to be spoken softly. In gender, it can be proclaimed loudly. There's a secular version of that as well, the sort of sociobiology that it's just in the genetic nature of male and female. Okay. And of course, the same in capitalism. The grotesque inequality in the distribution of material resources is naturalized. It's said to be the order of things. And in fact, there is, we should at least recognize, a kind of moral theory behind capitalism. It's perverse, but it is a moral theory, which is that this hierarchy is necessary to produce the greatest good, to be that great engine of production, and even though there is inequality, all benefit from it. Okay? So that's the commonality in all of these systems. The existence of a hierarchy, which of course is a product of human beings. We have these because over time people establish them and enforce them with coercion and violence. Yet because that coercion and violence and that hierarchy does violate at this point our own stated principles, there have to be these attempts to naturalize it. Now, I think if one goes outside of the holy trinity of race, gender, and class, you see that the same thing works in two other important arenas in modern life, and that is on the level of the nation. The United States dominating the world for a long time economically and militarily, now mostly just militarily. Right? Why? How? That's a hierarchy, yes? The United States' dominance in the world, it does not put the United States forward as one nation among many, all equally subordinated to international law and moral principle. No, the United States transcends that law and principle and can act with impunity. Why? Because it is the natural state of things. The theological version of this is that shining city upon the hill, touched by God, the first democracy in the world, destined to bring democracy to the rest of the world. There's a secular version of that. So we see this hierarchy and the fundamental immorality of it trumped by a naturalizing of it in the question of empire as well. And we also see it, of course, in perhaps the most profound and dangerous way in the assertion of the human right to dominate the living world. The product of really 10,000 years of history, going back to the time that human beings began to domesticate plants and animals, began to become agricultural people, giving rise to what we call civilization, and 10,000 years of the most uncivilized behavior imaginable, the great paradox of that term. And that same assertion of human domination, again, there's theological and secular versions of it, but the idea that human beings have a right to be on top of that hierarchy. Well, what does all of this produce? It produces a profound state of injustice and a fundamentally unsustainable world. So, what do we do? Well, here, I want to confess, I'm realistic. Right? I don't want to be some pie in the sky, idealistic, ivory tower academic. I'm a realist. I come from North Dakota. Right? Let me tell you, you think you got weather here. Go up to North Dakota. You get real realistic in North Dakota. You don't just sort of sit and wish away the blizzard. You get out there with the shovel and you keep shoveling, knowing that blizzard's coming back tomorrow. Actually, being from North Dakota really was good preparation for being a leftist in the contemporary period. The blizzard comes, you shovel the snow, you go in, you rest for a few minutes, you look out, and the blizzard has come again. And that goes on for basically about 6-8 months of the year. And then when that's over, the mosquitoes come. And we do all this. We got no beaches, and we got no mountains, right? None of the things that make life interesting in other parts of the world. So I'm often very grateful for having been born and raised in North Dakota. But I want to be realistic. Right? And I think that the only conclusion I can draw from the quick survey, which seemed to not be terribly controversial in the room, is that to be realistic is to be radical. In fact, to be realistic is to go to the nature of the system. It would be, in fact, profoundly unrealistic to believe that systems of hierarchy that produce as a matter of course injustice and an unsustainable world will somehow magically be transformed because we want them to be. There's no evidence in human history that has ever been the case, and I can't imagine it emerging now. So, I want to conclude, going back to my promise to be harsh, right, and to close the conference on a real downer note. Well, you don't want to leave happy, for God's sake. I'm from North Dakota. I've never been happy. Why should you be? I'm from North Dakota and I live in Texas. Nobody leaves happy. I'm sorry. Well, it don't work that way. So when people say, well, you know, that's all well and good, but let's be realistic, I say, yes, I want to be realistic. I would like to be able to believe that political activity is meaningful, and for it to be meaningful, it's going to have to go to the core of the hierarchies that produce the injustice, that produce the unsustainable world in which we live. And this is no longer a matter for parlor talk, right? Because that unsustainability is no longer out there. Right? Whatever one thinks about those questions of injustice, whether beings are somehow so profoundly, you know, screwed up that that the poor will always be among us, to quote one famous passage. Right? The question of ecological sustainability is not up for grabs. That one is, the data is clear. Right? And there is no way you can transform the high energy, high technology consumption lifestyle of the first world into a sustainable system. Right? And that means we have to start talking about all of these things, not because we want to be idealistic, but because we want to be realistic. So, where do we end? Well, first of all, I want to somewhat take issue with Rachel and say that the phrase should not be yes, we can. The phrase actually should be no, we can't. No, we can't, if by transformation we mean transformation within the existing systems. We can't do that. That is not possible. Right? And whatever one thinks of the Obama campaign or the Obama administration, I don't mean to be coy. I voted for him twice. I voted for him in the Texas primary, and I voted for him in the general election. Right? The commitment of this administration and the commitment of both major political parties to empire and capitalism means that no, we can't. Right? No, we cannot transform the world into a just world as long as the United States claims for itself that imperial position, and the Obama administration claims it every bit as much as the previous administration, which is to say that within weeks of being in office, Barack Obama did one thing which was completely predictable. He committed war crimes, which is what all U.S. leaders do, by virtue of the imperial system. Okay? No, we can't. We cannot do anything meaningful on the world stage within this context of a hierarchy established with American dominance. And no, we can't do anything about the unjust distribution of resources within a predatory corporate capitalist system because it's designed that way. So no, we can't. I'm sorry. What we can do, however, is commit to political activity that can attack those systems. Now there one has to truly be realistic. I hope I don't burst any bubbles, but the revolution is not just around the corner. I think the great task today is actually to commit to political struggle with no guarantees. And here I don't just mean no guarantees that we'll win tomorrow, or no guarantees that we'll win in our lifetime. I used to say I'm involved in political movements in which there's no guarantee that I will win in my lifetime. That's still true. Every political movement I've been involved in, whether it's feminist movements against men's violence and sexual exploitation, or movements against the U.S. empire, or movements for economic justice against capitalism, I have to accept that those movements may not win in my lifetime. I think we now have to accept that they may not win at all. And I think that, while it may sound like a downer, is actually my upbeat ending. See, you lower people's expectations, and then most anything you do to pull up sound to people going, well, it wasn't as bad as I thought he was going to end, quite frankly. It was so... That sounds counterintuitive, right? To make the claim that we have to engage in political activity that may not only be successful within our lifetimes, but may not be possible, would seem not to be the basis for a big upbeat ending. In other words, to claim that we have to accept the possibility that the human species may be an evolutionary dead end, right, doesn't seem to be the ground of great optimism. Right? But I think that's a place to start. Right? Just because we want to overcome thousands of years of entrenched hierarchy and injustice, just because we want to doesn't mean we can. Right? This is not like waking up one morning and deciding you're going to turn over a new leaf and start eating healthy. That's hard enough, but it's not like that. It's like turning a huge ship that is dangerously close to the rocks. No guarantee you can do it. And I think that's worth considering is the big brain, right? This brain that we've had. Human beings like us for about 200,000 years on this planet with the big brain. We just may be an evolutionary dead end. That's a blink of an eye in geologic time. Right? I mean, we like to think we're special, but why? There's no guarantee of it. And that means there's no guarantee we can achieve what we want to achieve. Now, why would that be the ground for optimism? Because I think too often political organizers fall prey to the inclination to want to bolster people, to give them, as it's often said, hope. And I think that's the wrong approach. I don't think we should give people hope in our positions as educators or organizers. I don't think hope is something you give to people. I think hope is something people earn. And you earn it by doing things. You earn it by engaging in struggles. And I think we have to do that even with the understanding that those struggles may not be winnable, and that you commit to them not because you're going to win, not because there is a promise of some gratification, but because it is what it means to be a human being, is to commit to those struggles. And I think that's actually a selling point for progressive politics, for radical politics. Right? This culture gives people a lot. Right? Even people who are not in the wealthy sector live at an incredible level in this culture, if you think about it historically. This is the most affluent culture in the history of the world, and that affluence goes deeply down into even working class folks. Right? There is a small kind of internal third world in the United States, but for the most part, this culture lives at levels that were unheard of in previous centuries. Right? The culture gives us a lot. It's what I tend to refer to as the cheap toys of empire. You know, big TVs, big houses, cheap food, fast cars. It gives us a lot. The one thing this culture doesn't give us is meaning. This culture does a very bad job of providing meaning. And educators and organizers working for real radical change can offer that meaning, but it's offered with no guarantees. Right? It's not given to people, it's offered for people to earn. And when one earns that, one comes into a new way of being human. And I think the fact that we don't always know what the task in front of us is, what the job is, what the movement is, what the tactic is, what the strategy is to take us forward, should not impede us. And in fact, I think this is a period, given the failures of past organizing strategies around so many of these issues, to embrace the fact that we don't necessarily know. And there's a kind of liberation in that. Just as there's a liberation in realizing that you may not win, yet you can still struggle because it provides meaning. There's a liberation in realizing you don't need to know the exact strategy, the exact tactic. And I want to end with a poem, or part of a poem, by one of my favorite writers, Wendell Berry. Many of you may know Wendell Berry. He's a novelist, a poet, and an essayist, a brilliant writer, I think one of the great writers of the last half of the 20th century in the US, often seen as sort of the poet laureate of the sustainable agriculture movement. He's also a working farmer in Kentucky. And one of my favorite poems by Barry is called The Real Work. And he says, "It may be that when we no longer know what to do, we have come to our real work. And that when we no longer know which way to go, we have come to our real journey. The mind that is not baffled is not employed. The impeded stream is the one that sings." And I think my last reflection, which is an idea that's grown every year that I teach, it gets a little deeper, is that our task as educators, and often as organizers as well, is not to give student answers. We know that. Often we say that as if we know the answers, but our job is just not to give them to students because they have to come to them on their own, you know. But I think it's, for me, I would have said that for years. Well, you know, my job is not to give student answers. But there's always that sort of implication that somehow I might know them myself. I've given up that hubris and recognized that our job is not only not to give students answers, but to not be afraid to step in front of students and say, we have no answers in that definitive sense, that there may not be answers in that definitive sense, but to live a meaningful life is to live in struggle and to find the joy in that struggle. Thank you. Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks. Okay. My apologies, I went a little longer than I was supposed to. The session is supposed to end at 8:15. It's right now 8:10. I'm going to look to Eugene for guidance. Is there, do you want, I never did much like smart-ass conference organizers. Now, should we? That's fine. I don't know if there's a microphone, but I think if people stand up and speak to the audience, not just up front, we can probably hear. Not only questions, comments, challenges. Yeah. What do you think about turning point theories? About turning point theories. Turning points about, I mean, I really appreciate your prophetic voice, your own prophetic voice coming through in that tradition. Yeah. Here in the last part of your talk, and I worry about a lot of these things too. And also, Wendell Berry said, "Be joyful though you have considered all the facts." Yes. For me, yeah. So, I've been thinking about this with regard to, and Al Gore has been kind of pushed forward his message with his own conversation about whether turning points are possible. That a lot of our major turning points, social turning points, historically often happen in short periods of time after a long period of time. Yeah. And you see those At first, I thought you meant tipping points in the sense that, because we talk about those two things, tipping points in natural systems, such as tipping point in climate change, and that what in terms of CO2 may be irrelevant because the forces unleashed are now in a feedback loop that may make it impossible really to pull back, which even that doesn't mean our work is done. It doesn't mean, you know, let's go get a 12-pack and because one can organize and work to change a system when one believes there's still time to do that. That time has passed. Make humane, just as possible. Points in I think those are possible, again, if we correctly diagnose the nature of the problem. And for all the work Al Gore did, for instance, to dramatize and spread the word about climate change, in some sense his presentation I found sadly lacking, because at the end his willingness to take on the system from which these problems arise evaporates, because he's part of them. Even though he's been freed up a bit by leaving electoral politics, he's still part of the system. He still either has faith or lacks the courage to speak out against a capitalist system or against U.S. domination. And so Al Gore is simply slightly less in denial than other parts of that mainstream. And whether we're at a turning point or whether those quick turning points can happen, I'm not optimistic about that, at least not till we start telling the truth about the nature of the system we live in. Yeah. For some reason, I'm not seeing hands, so... Oh, okay. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
I'm curious about what you think about the situation in Colorado currently, and based on your statement about needing to do radical politics, we're approaching a time by 2010 that we may have one non-white in the Colorado legislature by 2010 if current events keep unfolding as they are right now. And when you look at each party, their primary bases are all 50-plus Caucasians.
Mm-hmm.
Those are the people who are electing their people within their party for an associate seat. Do you see any way of changing this tide within electoral politics in Colorado, kind of based on your voice and what you've been saying?
Well, you may have sort of seen the hints that I don't spend much time thinking about electoral politics at all. No, and not out of some cynical, oh, it's just a bunch of corrupt bastards in Washington. I just don't think that's a meaningful level of interaction at this point. I don't mean that there aren't times and places where voting doesn't matter. I vote. I especially try to vote in local elections where I think there's actually a more direct connection between voting and results. But I don't think when we talk about the more basic structural problems, I don't think there is any change that is going to come from electoral politics from Washington. Those are systems committed to continuing the existing system. And therefore, I don't think that's where the action is in a sense. I think that's true in general of large institutions. Never bureaucratic institutions for anything, and that includes my own university. It seems to me these are places where one tries to leverage what can be leveraged out of them. University of Texas as a place to be explored, chance, resources, it's all sorts of things. But I don't look to the University of Texas to be an agent for change, given the nature of the structure of that institution. I don't look to electoral politics or conventional political parties. At this point, I don't even look much to traditional social movements, quite frankly. So I've been part of a lot of traditional social movements, anti-war movement. And the anti-war movement over the last 6 or 7 years has been an abject failure. And I'm not saying that critical of the people who design strategies, because I don't have a better strategy. But there's something about the dynamics in contemporary culture that means old ways of pursuing anti-war policies, for instance, simply have not been workable. And I think what that means to me is that while one still tries to intervene in electoral politics when there's something meaningful at stake, and where one still contributes to movement politics of the traditional kind, labor movement, feminist movement, because it's important to keep those ideas alive, and for those of us with certain amounts of resources and privilege to commit to movements that can advance that, even if they're not working all that well. The other level is what I would just call the level of local experiments, right? That when things are not working at those other levels, I don't really see the argument for putting energy into failed projects, right? If there was an anti-war movement that was about to win, put my energy into it, but it's not. I can, however, put my energy into local experiments at alternatives to the existing system. And that just sort of happens to be what I've been trying to do the last year, especially in Austin, right? So if one believes capitalism is fundamentally unjust, one can pursue traditional labor union organizing, all sorts of things. But another level is to try and create alternatives. So I've been working with some younger people in the immigrant rights community, to try and think through how we could create worker-owned, worker-run businesses that would take, especially people in the most vulnerable positions in the lowest paid jobs, organized into worker-owned businesses to try and in doing so, not only directly benefiting those people in that business, but creating an alternative model, creating a project that has a tangible goal that people from different racial groups can commit to. So it may not look like racial justice work on the surface, but by trying to create a common goal that people across, especially generational and racial and ethnic lines, can endorse, you create the natural conditions under which people work together and form new kinds of bonds, which then become racial justice projects. And when approached with an understanding of the patterns in patriarchy, can also build into them a gender justice component. I mean, all of this stuff is a different level to think politically. And that's where I'm putting my energy, not because I know for sure that's where the payoff is, but based on my own experience. And other people will engage in other places. I have friends who still I just don't have money. Still contribute to traditional social movements. Makes sense, and I have, you know, the ability to do so. But that's a kind of broad look, really not directly responsive to your question. But I don't have much to say about strategizing for electoral politics these days, especially when there's no meaningful political parties in the United States, which there is not. It doesn't mean the two are identical. It just means there is no meaningful political party structure in the United States. In that sense, if I were to offer electoral politics advice, destroy the Democratic Party. That's the first step. I think that there will not be meaningful electoral politics till the Democratic Party is destroyed in its current form, right? As a voice of the corporate sector.
So, I'm aware that we're now past time.
Okay.
But Dr. Jensen is going to be upstairs. They're selling his book. We'll be happy to sign your book and chat with people more. So upstairs in the second floor lobby.
Okay.
So thank you, Dr.
Thank you, Eugene. Thanks, everybody.